Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the CEVRO Institute. My name is Shima. I'm president of this school, CEVRO Institut School of Legal and Social Studies, which is a private university, small and elite private university, where students can study political science and international relations, public administration and public law, law and business, and economic policy. And I'm very happy to add events such as this one. This is Prague Conference on Political Economy, which is a project that started 10 years ago, a long time ago. At that time, I met with my student, Cuhel, who, by the way, finished his PhD at the George Mason University recently. And we thought that actually something must be done. That we both liked Austrian economics, political economy of freedom. We all attended events outside Europe, and we thought, well, this is wrong, because here in Prague, we actually have something to build up. That there, in the old days, used to be a center of economic and political thinking and scholarship. The Austrian School of Economics, after all, sort of originated here, and the great Austrian scholars spent some time here in Prague, taught students who were studying, who were doing research or publishing books, and we thought that especially in post-communist Europe, we have to go back to these traditions. We don't need to import them from overseas, because these traditions are our traditions. So we decided that we will come up with a project that would attempt to reclaim the old tradition. A tradition of broadly defined economics with links to political theory, legal theory, ethics. Simply, we wanted to build a platform for people who want to do scholarly work and research and study society from below. We like bottom-up approaches, and we believe to understand what is happening in society is to see it from below, not to take a position of a center planner and then claim that we know how to shape the world. So the idea of having a conference emerged, and we wanted always to have two keynote speeches, which we linked to important scholars whose life is tied to the city of Prague. The first one is Friedrich von Wieser, who, as you know, is the second generation of the Austrian school. Wieser taught here in Prague almost 20 years and left Prague only to replace Karl Munger in Vienna when Munger retired. And indeed, Friedrich von Wieser, among many other things, is a man who coined the term opportunity costs. And actually, if we want to understand what is happening today, especially in the field of public policies, well, then opportunity cost is typically half of the answer. So the first annual talk is named after Friedrich von Wieser. The second annual talk is linked to a semi-forgotten scholar of Czech origin, Franz, Cuhel, who was a student of Wieser, attended his famous seminars. And Cuhel wrote a book called On the Theory of Needs in 1907, in which he talked about utility, about how we perceive utility, and he came up with the idea of utility being ordinal rather than cardinal value. This was very much acknowledged by Ludwig von Mises, and Mises several times quotes Franz Cuhel in his books, including Human Action. And Mises indeed was not the only one. People like Fritz Machlup or Slutsky or Webber himself made references to this Czech economist Cuhel. And 10 years ago, nobody even knew that we had an economist who actually made a substantial contribution, which was appreciated by other top scholars. And indeed, many of you know that when Mario Wolfbart wrote about Mises, he referred to the utility theory, the understanding of utility as ordinal, as Mises-Cuhel utility theory. So, we want to remind the scholarly audience that there are Austrian and Czech economists who also contributed substantially to the development of economics. So this was the original idea, and over the last 10 years we had great scholars giving the annual talks, and then hundreds of scholars presenting paper, which is always the second sort of half of the conference. And as always, this year we also have outstanding speakers. The first one is Martin Ricketts, who will deliver the Friedrich von Wieser annual lecture. Professor Ricketts is Dean of Humanities at the University of Buckingham, the UK's top university for student satisfaction. Professor Ricketts is Professor of Economic Organization. He graduated from the University of Newcastle and got his PhD from the University of York. He has published in professional journals such as the American Economic Review, Journal of Institutional and Theoretical Economics, or Journal of Public Policy. He published on the theory of the firm, aspects of public finance, the new institutional economics, and housing policy. Among other things, he is also the author of a great textbook, The Economics of Business Enterprise, which was published by Edward Elder Publishing. He worked as a research economist at the Industrial Policy Group, was research fellow at the Institute of Social and Economic Research at the University of York. He has been with the University of Buckingham, the great free marketplace university, which is a sort of example for the CEVRO Institute since 1977. Among many other things, he is also chairman of the International Advisory Council and a managing trustee of the Institute of Economic Affairs, the oldest European free market think tank. Professor Ricketts, please approach me to receive PCPE 2014 Friedrich von Wieser Prize for Excellence in Economic Education.
Actually, I entitled the lecture Adverse Selection, Gresham's Law and State Regulation, just so that I should really be up to date and put the title on the slides and so forth, but I'm afraid I'd be very old-fashioned, and it's a pity, but you just have to listen to my lecture. I hope that it won't get too tedious for you. I've been warned that it must be no more than 40 or so minutes, so I will try and keep to that injunction, even if it means a certain amount of paraphrasing and so on as we go on. But I was delighted to be invited to give this lecture. And the fact that the lecture is named in Wieser's honour encouraged me to think about the ways that this topic relates to his legacy. Because, as has already been said, as a leading member of the Austrian school, influenced by Karl Menger, he was actually quite critical, at least according to my textbook, that I read actually as a student many years ago, written by Terence Hutchison, the Review of Economic Doctrines. Menger was quite critical of methodological individualism and interested not merely in the formal theory of choice, but wider historical and sociological studies. And just before the First World War, the state was everywhere extending its reach. It seemed to be pretty universal. The doctrine of laissez-faire associated with the French physiocrats and the English classical economists had lost its dominance. Wieser was in this respect, I think, if I'm right, I have no doubt I can be corrected afterwards, but he was fully in tune with the spirit of the times in which he lived, and was highly critical of traditional non-intervention. In his 1913 book, Social Economics, or that is the English translation, he wrote, and I'm quoting now from him, as translated by Hutchison, "The recognition of the state's protective duty is the most important theoretical result of modern economic policy. German economists may take pride in having established it and broken the spell of the classical dogmas." Well, my theme today directly concerns what Wieser refers to as the state's protective duty. For we live in an age in which this protective duty has been used to justify an expanding panoply of regulatory measures. We can only guess what Wieser would have made of them. It seems that he regarded competition as potentially dangerous, often unfair, and socially disruptive. He clearly supported a certain amount of protection, but at the same time, Wieser understood the dangers of concentrating economic power in the hands of the state and emphasized the essential role of competition in securing economic progress. So, again, quoting from Wieser, "No economic order," he wrote, "without suffering very great disadvantages, may dispense with the use in one way or another of the supreme power of competition." His reasons are those that we would expect to be associated with the Austrian school. The use of information and the provision of incentives. He refers to, again I quote, "thousands and millions of human beings seeing with thousands and millions of eyes, exerting as many wills." That's a translation, I don't know if it's a good one or not, but I felt it did emphasize this importance of gathering information from all sorts of different places, highly decentralized, impossible for a central power to be acquainted with. No central power could ever be informed, he says, of the countless possibilities to be met with in every individual case, while the private constitution of the economy is what is needed to enlist the tremendous force of self-interest in the service of economic life. Well, we come to the classic dilemma then. The dilemma, of course, of the protective duty of the state, which Wieser seems to think is a great advance, but how can it be pursued through regulatory measures which don't undermine the social potential of the competitive system, which again, Wieser clearly thinks is a most important social institution. Well, my aim in this lecture then is to explore this dilemma effects of modern regulatory intervention designed to resist the assumed tendency of competition to undermine quality. For, just as a century or more ago, economists of Wieser's generation widely expected competition to impoverish and oppress whole classes of people, those of the modern era are similarly sceptical of competition as a benign force. Certainly the growth of regulation in areas such as consumer protection or employment rights has been substantial since the 1970s and before, of course. It's commonly argued that competitive markets, if unregulated, will result in a race to the bottom as suppliers try to reduce costs. Goods will become less reliable and shoddy, food adulterated, educational standards debased, financial security compromised, health establishments and care homes subject to eroding standards, workplaces less safe. The financial crisis of 2008 is popularly regarded as an outcome of unregulated free market capitalism, with banks extending credit to less and less creditworthy borrowers and selling securities of progressively lower quality to an unsuspecting public. So this general suspicion of unregulated competitive markets has been buttressed by many developments in economic theory. Over 40 years ago, George Akerlof published a paper, The Market for Lemons, on the adverse selection problem, which became a highly cited progenitor of important 20th century field of research, the economics of information. I mean, I remember that paper coming out. I'm old enough, actually, to have been a student when it came out, and I had no idea, in fact, at the time, what these lemons were. I assumed it really was the market in lemons, so not knowing the American term. But I've since been enlightened as to that. But the paper considered the operation of competitive markets when transactors were uncertain about the quality of the goods and services being traded. It was influential because it presented a simple formalization of the problem, using as a stylized example the market in second-hand cars. If information were asymmetrically distributed between buyers and sellers, so that buyers could not tell the difference between a good car and a bad car, or a lemon, sellers of relatively good cars would find the single price established in a competitive marketplace unattractive. Sellers of relatively bad cars, on the other hand, would be more than likely to find that the prevailing price exceeded their reservation value and would be happy to sell. Even if this problem did not entirely destroy the market in second-hand cars, the average quality of car trading would tend to be low, and the highest quality cars would be untraded because of the impossibility of conveying the necessary information to the market participants. Akerlof also pointed out the ubiquitous nature of this problem. The associate mentions the structure of financial markets, where a lot of trust obviously is needed, the hiring of labour, where you might not be able to tell the difference between a good worker and a bad one, a skilled one or a bad one, the role of educational institutions in certifying talent, trying to signal one's value to potential employers, the cost of dishonesty in developing countries. Developing countries will face these kind of trust problems to a huge extent. That's a very common issue, obviously, in development economics. But it's hardly surprising, in the light of this intellectual background then, that the protective role of the state as a regulator of quality is rarely seriously challenged. But in this lecture, I will argue that the conditions under which state regulation is likely to improve on market outcomes are much more restrictive than is usually assumed. Further, I'll argue that the very introduction of state regulation is capable of encouraging a race to the bottom and subverting the various institutional mechanisms that otherwise would resist quality debasement. The much criticised operation of banking and financial markets, for example, did not happen in an unregulated environment. My colleague Philip Booth at the Institute of Economic Affairs pointed out recently in one of the IEA TV things that I was looking at the other day, an introduction to his IEA study, Verdict on the Crash. But he pointed out that the United Kingdom Financial Services Authority Regulation Handbook ran to hundreds of thousands of paragraphs under a mass of sections, subsections, and subsets subsections. It is grossly misleading to think of financial markets in the early 21st century as having been unregulated or only lightly regulated. We should at least consider the proposition that regulation was part of the problem. And that the system is capable, the state regulation is capable of causing rather than preventing adverse selection, can be immediately seen really by considering the obvious canonical case, Gresham's law. Popularly, of course, this law is simply specified as bad money drives out good. The idea, really, that that in a free market, low-quality items will displace higher-quality items is popularly associated with the name of Gresham. Actually, I think that the actual law has been misassigned, as is often the case, but I will leave that historical detail to footnote and continue quickly. But in considering the market for lemons, Akerlof himself comments in this 1970 paper that, as he puts it, the bad cars tend to drive out the good in much the same way that bad money drives out good. And therefore, quoting him again, Gresham's law has made a modified appearance. Immediately, however, he goes on to recognize a crucial difference, problem. In the case of second-hand cars, one side of the transaction, the buyer, according to his assumptions, cannot tell a good car from a bad car. In the case of Gresham's law, again I quote Akerlof here, presumably both buyer and seller can tell the difference between good and bad money. The analogy between the market for lemons and Gresham's law, argues Akerlof, is, he says it again, instructive but not complete. Well, instructive it might be as an example, handled by a master theorist like Akerlof, but it is also highly misleading, it seems to me. The essential point about Gresham's law is that it applies to a situation in which a powerful regulatory force is at work. How can it be that in a situation where the quality of money is reasonably easily, I say, checked, sellers of goods are induced to accept bad money in exchange instead of insisting on good money? The answer, presumably, is that certain coins are given a specified nominal value by law and can be used as legal tender to settle debts and make payments. So a false parity between good and bad coins is enforced by the state. Creditors can be forced to accept bad money in settlement of debts, and the debtors will much prefer to use bad money for this purpose than any better quality coins they might also possess, and would much prefer to keep as a store of value. The similarity between the cases of Akerlof's bad cars and Gresham's bad money is that transactors are unable to take account of important pieces of information in their market behavior. The difference, however, is crucial. In the market for lemons, buyers obviously cannot react to information they do not have. They cannot avoid the risk of buying a bad car by rejecting it because they cannot tell a good car from a bad car. In Gresham's money markets, sellers and creditors are not permitted to act, or, as I will argue later, more generally, do not have an incentive to act, whether or not they happen to know about the quality of the money on offer. Sellers cannot avoid being paid in bad money because parity between good and bad is enforced by the state, and the fear of loss is mitigated by the knowledge that bad money is as useful as good money for purely transactional purposes. In both cases, adverse selection is the result. Bad cars are traded, bad money is used. It is clear, however, that the situation analysed by Gresham's law is a case of what might be called regulatory adverse selection. And it's a complete misunderstanding to regard it as a useful analogy or a sort of canonical case for the activities of a competitive market. It is properly considered a classic example of what happens when the usual responses of traders that would be anticipated in a competitive market are suppressed or rendered more costly by regulatory intervention. Gresham's law, therefore, operates in the presence of specific regulatory measures that raise the cost to market participants of gaining information about the relative quality of goods and services. Akerlof's market, according to his model in his classic article, operates in the absence of regulatory measures, of course. But it just assumes that information costs are high relative to the potential gains to trade, and in the simplest formulation, assumes that information about quality is unavailable at any economic cost. But in any continuing market process, we would expect the transactors to look for ways of improving on information flows, or of mitigating these knowledge asymmetries. Now again, if we look at Akerlof's paper, he recognises that counteracting institutions will emerge, as he puts it, such as quality guarantees, which load the risk of poor quality onto the supplier. Presumably the supplier would have better knowledge. The evolution of the brand names, the development of certification through membership of professional associations, trade bodies, educational establishments, and so on. So these developments spontaneously might exist. He criticises some of these, though, curiously, and I will skip over some of this part of my paper, but he criticises some of them for being non-atomistic, as he puts it, and therefore concentrations of power. In other words, if you have a trade association which is designed to mitigate the effects of adverse selection and ensure quality, it might not be a good thing. Why? Well, because it's non-atomistic. It's interesting that economists are so terrified to depart from this atomistic model where we don't have this kind of social environment to work in. But anyway, I hope I've made the general point that if you look at the background, there is this general assumption, if you like, popularly. I don't mean in this hall today, but I mean popularly, a general assumption that competition erodes quality. There's a thing called a race to the bottom. That to some extent this has been supported by theoretical developments, which I think have then not been fully understood. In particular, the use of the term Gresham's law is very misleading because it is precisely Gresham's law that shows adverse selection occurring when a regulator intervenes. It's not the result of a true competitive market. Well, obviously, let's look at some of these some of these ideas that Akerlof actually mentions. Some of these spontaneous responses you'd expect in market, well, not just in markets, but in a free system. Michael was talking last night about freedom of choice and construction of non-coerced institutions. Well, this is the way, of course, we'd expect some of these problems to be handled. And the first, obviously, is reputation. The trade-inhibiting effects of information asymmetry can easily be constructed in theoretical models, obviously. We find that only low-quality goods are going to be traded under some conditions. If only low-quality goods trading low-quality goods might be possible. It's very easy if we expect that if a seller can make a greater profit by delivering a low-quality product and a higher-quality product, then you expect in a single-shot game to be delivered with the low-quality item. But of course, you're not really in the world of the race to the bottom there. You're in a world of an equilibrium which you can set up in the classroom. There's actually no race. Races take time. And it's the passage of time that can change the calculations of traders in the market. So it's the possibility of repeat dealing, obviously, that leads to the possibility of reputation being generated. Two atomistic traders might never really begin to be able to exchange high-quality products, but with the possibility of repeat deals going into the future, we know that it's possible to model very formally the generation of reputation and trust and so forth. So then, essentially, social and institutional contents can be introduced by simply accepting that the traders are embedded in a social environment and that they're likely to take account of the effect of their actions on opportunities to trade in the future. So we get reputation as an important generator, if you like, of trust and a way out of this apparent dilemma that we can obviously set up if we want to in the classroom. But what other institutions are there? Well, obviously we might go for the monitoring and enforcement of quality standards. Instead of relying on repeat dealing market processes, the evolution of reputation, an alternative mechanism to cope with adverse selection is to use the services of a specialised monitor. So the monitor observes the activities of the supplier, and if he or she discovers behaviour that will lead to low quality or sees low quality ex post, a penalty or fine is imposed. So, pretty clearly, if you have a risk-neutral supplier, the expected fine must exceed the relative gain that they would otherwise achieve from producing low quality rather than high quality goods. So, a given level of fine sufficiently great will induce high quality rather than low quality. But in this context, the main point is to establish why any of the market transactors should believe that a quality monitor would actually have an incentive to do the job, or could be relied upon to do it also. Sometimes, for example, the quality monitor will be established maybe by a process of integration. Suppose there's a problem in buying and selling certain items over quality, while the buyer might simply take over the supplier. In other words, the firm will substitute for the market, and the owner of the integrated firm will establish internal quality assurance arrangements. Well, such an owner will presumably have suitable incentives, provided that he or she is a residual claimant and can gain some of the benefits of higher quality. Alternatively, of course, a group of buyers might get together, and this happened a lot in the 19th century in the English context, to establish, say, a mutual enterprise to control or exert control over quality. I mean, it was fear of bad quality that led really to the retail cooperatives in the 19th century in England. There was a natural tendency then for consumers to own retail outlets and to develop control over the quality of the items that they were being offered. So not just a middle class, but a working class actual evolution there. In fact, the middle class cooperatives came rather later than the working class ones. The Army and Navy stores in London, for example, which you can still visit in Victoria Street, started out as a middle class cooperative rather later in the 19th century, as consumers tried to reassure themselves about the quality of the goods that they were being offered. There's a whole range of goods that they hadn't really had to judge before. Okay, well, in each of these cases then, the point is that arm's length market transactions are being superseded by internal governance of one form or another. So it's a kind of Coasian solution. Ronald Coas's terminology could be used, we could say, that at a high cost of using the market mechanism because of adverse selection is counteracted by the contractual setting of the firm. And up to a point, depending upon the details, obviously, the firm might be more effective than arm's length transacting. Well, an alternative way forward is, of course, the trade association. Because here we're dealing with even looser form of spontaneously evolved quality assurance. Members of a trade association might gain from being associated with a reputable peer group and so on. And these kind of clubs, laying down rules with which members will be expected to comply, can develop quite spontaneously. So I've moved, if you like, from reputation to internal governance to cooperative solutions to trade associations and so on. These have all, at different times in history, developed quite spontaneously to deal with quality issues. Well, okay, but then what about state regulation? That was so much of in a sense, a preamble to just to make the point that I imagine most of us in this room are going to be sympathetic to, and that is that in a free society, people will respond in different ways to the quality problem. Well, what about the state then? What happens when the state intervenes? Well, although it's possible to imagine extreme circumstances in which government regulation is introduced in order to cope with the total absence of any alternative mechanism for assuring quality, the focus of my paper is the consequence of introducing state regulation as a supplement to already existing institutional responses. I would imagine, actually, that this is the normal case. The idea that one never ever finds a totally unregulated, even by private means, regulated set of transactions strikes me as being rather curious. I mean, we have all sorts of institutional structures there to govern markets, spontaneously evolved, without the state being a sort of motivating force. But anyway, I would have thought that the most interesting thing is to look at what happens, therefore, when the state begins to think that these mechanisms aren't good enough in some way. So they introduce a regulatory system. Well, the possibility that the introduction of state regulation might actually exacerbate the problem of adverse selection derives from the effect that it has on the existing institutional arrangements. The imposition of a state monitor, for example, will not necessarily leave unchanged the probability that a seller will lose in future trading opportunities by shading on quality. It's not, I would argue, reasonable to assume that the knowledge that a firm is now regulated by a state agency will leave unchanged the probability that a low-quality strategy will result in, say, an adverse consequence of a collapse in future sales. I mean, if consumers interpreted instances of low quality as aberrations of the resultant chance, if the state regulator and if the state regulator gave buyers confidence that all firms were adopting a high-quality strategy, I think it's most unlikely, but suppose they did, the relative gain to providing higher quality rather than low-quality goods and services would be undermined. So, in the extreme case, buyers might discount their own experience of the gossip of the marketplace and instead place total confidence in the reassurance offered by the state regulator. Such total reliance on state regulation and quality would effectively entirely undermine the mechanism that prior to state regulation buttressed the evolution of firm-specific reputations. A similar argument can be developed in respect of privately established monitoring and enforcement arrangements. If, for example, there are costs associated with running vertically integrated supply chains, the existence of a state regulator will undermine this form of quality assurance, and a general disintegration of the industry would be predicted as transactors begin to free ride on the publicly provided regulatory service. The role of the trade association in quality assurance might also be compromised, as firms now find that compliance with state-imposed regulatory norms is more important to establishing the confidence of the public than is membership of a particular professional or trade body. The latter, the trade body, will still be important to its membership for political lobbying and the protection of a privileged position in the market, but the more socially productive the role in the way that you could argue was originally set up for, the more socially productive role of maintaining quality standards will be subtly subverted. As the additional value of the membership and the credibility conferred by the trade association declines, the resources devoted to monitoring enforcement will be reduced, the danger of detection of low quality will decline, and the perceived cost of expulsion, the potential fine, if you like, from the trade association, will no longer appear such a draconian sanction. Well, the fact that state regulation might substitute for existing mechanisms for establishing credibility with buyers wouldn't seem to be a problem, of course, if it could be relied upon to produce a superior outcome. The reduced importance of firm-specific reputation or of professional associations or a greater vertical disintegration of the industry or something would not matter it would not be a matter of concern if the state-imposed monetary enforcement mechanisms that replace them produce net social benefits. However, to work effectively, such mechanisms would require a suitable environment, one in which the information and incentive problems facing the regulator could be addressed reasonably easily. And, well, I think this is really, I'm conscious of the time advancing, I think this is really quite unlikely contingency, if you like. Clearly, if all transactors were perfectly informed about the effectiveness of state regulation, they would take this information into account in their dealings. So, for example, if all buyers and sellers knew, beyond doubt, that the state was a totally ineffective regulator, well then, buyers presumably would not adjust their behaviour, and sellers would not anticipate any change in the probability that they would be punished by future loss of revenue for a low-quality strategy. Paradoxically, it's misplaced confidence in the effectiveness of the state regulator that is most dangerous in producing regulatory adverse selection. Notoriously poor state regulation is presumably not good for the functioning of markets and could be symptomatic of an even deeper problem with the reliability of legal institutions in a country. But at least it cannot undermine further whatever privately involved governance arrangements are existent. States normally associated with very high-quality legal institutions, on the other hand, run a high risk of encouraging adverse selection if they cannot live up to this reputation for effective governance in particular areas. So let me just look at some of these areas. I think, how am I to talk? Can you tell me, Joseph? You gave me 45 minutes, but...
you still have 12.
I've still got 12 minutes, excellent. Well, there we are, 10 minutes. I'll try not to try your patience too long, but there are a number of sort of examples, if you like, that I've simply taken to illustrate the case. In the case of the first case is educational certification. I don't want to bore you with the details of the English system, but students take examinations called advanced level in England. And in England and Wales, these certificates of achievement at advanced level, they're taken at 18 years of age, can be seen as a form of currency that could be used to gain admittance to further and higher education opportunities. Well, during the 30 years, from 1952 to 1982, the pass rate in these examinations remained at 70%. This was because the examination was, I think, the technical term, I'm not an educationist, is norm referenced. In other words, the pass rate, as well as the percentage of A grades, was determined in advance. So it was determined that 70% would pass this exam, 30% would fail the exam. Now, such a system can be criticised from many different points of view. It's not my purpose to discuss its educational merits. Clearly, a general rise or fall in educational standards would not be captured and revealed by this system. And there are no doubt many objections to a system that produced a 30% failure rate, even as the number of candidates taking a higher level examination expanded. And actually, of course, the numbers going on to university expanded enormously over that period. Nevertheless, the feature that's most important here is its enforceability. Predetermined pass rates are not an absolute guarantor of unchanging quality, but everyone knows what they are, and they're cheap to enforce and to verify. Examination boards have the task of producing a ranking, and the candidates are implicitly compared with each other, rather than against some absolute standard. After 1982, the examination became standards-based. The complexity and measurement difficulties associated with such standards make them far less verifiable by users and regulators alike. On the other hand, the comparability of the qualifications awarded by all the various regulating bodies is declared as a declared objective of the regulator. The Office of Qualifications and Examinations Regulation, this is the most recent successor to the school's curriculum and assessment authority, states on its website, one of our strategic objectives is to secure and, where necessary, reset the standards of qualifications and assessment and to promote confidence in them. Thus, persuading people that educational qualifications at a given level offered by alternative providers are equivalent is an objective in itself. We monitor awarding organisations and qualifications to make sure that standards are maintained. Well, in the 30 years after 1982, the pass rate for A-level examinations increased from 68.2% to 98% in 2012. Similarly, the percentage of candidates gaining passes in grades A, between A and C, rose from 54 to 77% in 2012. So that's a considerable increase. Now, similar effects can be seen in higher education as well. I'm going to skip these sections because it simply repeats the essential point, but the proportion of people graduating with first-class honours degrees, for example, has increased substantially as universities have become more and more regulated. In 1995, 7% of graduates by full-time study in England received a first-class honours degree, like grade point average above a certain level, I suppose. By 2011 to 12, it was 16.6%. But there is a regulator trying to establish that first-class degrees in Cambridge are the same as first-class degrees in York or any other institution. And there are league tables which encourage universities to award more first-class degrees because then the output that they're producing is of higher quality. And hence, again, this apparent, rather extreme change in outcome. Finally, let me just quickly look at financial services. There are many things, obviously, you can look at, or might look at there, but in the early days of the development of the financial sector, it's not surprising that financial institutions were often founded on mutual or club principles. In life assurance, for example, the early societies, such as the Amicable Society, set up at the end of the 18th century, and other societies were clearly mutual societies. Even when outside shareholders began to be used in the 19th century, so, for example, with the Prudential Mutual Assurance Investment and Loan Association in 1850, the structure adopted was one of profit sharing between policyholders and outside investors. So, policyholders received 80% of new profits and outside investors 20%. Now, the gradual extension of state regulation into banking and insurance markets had a significant effect on the ability of mutual organisations to compete against the joint stock company. This was true not merely in the UK, but also in the United States and in Australia. So you get a trend, if you look at the history of this kind of institutional area, you find that there are sort of waves of political support for mutuals or not, as the case may be. The Armstrong Commission in the United States in 1905 signalled a move towards mutual organisation. I'm not necessarily recommending one or the other, but simply pointing out that regulation, insofar as it established a sense of confidence and insofar as it inculcated the idea that there wasn't really much difference between the safety of this particular type of organisation and another type of organisation, that will obviously undermine the one with maybe slightly higher costs and so on, but it meant that you couldn't really build a reputation on greater safety, or it made it more costly to build such a special reputation. An interesting historical example of this, adverse selection, of course, it was in the United States with respect to the provision of deposit insurance. The premium payable by banks for deposit insurance after 1933 was, interestingly, the same, irrespective of its governance structure. So Hansman, who wrote a most interesting book on all this sort of institutional background, the ownership of enterprise in 1996, Henry Hansman points out, after 1933, it was consequently only the government and not customers that had any reason to prefer mutuals over investor-owned banks on account of their greater safety. In the 1980s, a wave of bankruptcy affecting the savings and loan sector as the competing banks have gradually taken on more and more risk, unmonitored by their customers, who were secure in the knowledge that the federal government would come to their aid in a crisis that took place in the 1980s, as you know. Well, there are, I mean, my final reference would be to the capital reserves which are required by joint stock banks. It is interesting that there were no, a recent paper by Forrest Capey and Geoffrey Wood for the IEA pointed out